Hello listeners, and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, bringing you energy matters in an informal setting. In today's pod, we return to France and its plans for renewables deployment and objectives for new nuclear. The key question is, can it afford to do both in the long term? After being a net importer of power, the country's returned to a position of Central West Europe's electricity exporting powerhouse. But as France's neighbours roll out renewable expansion, particularly solar, which sends prices tumbling, is the country and the region heading for an oversupply of power? And what does this mean for France's renewables and nuclear ambitions? Helping me, Richard Sverrisson, to discuss these issues and much more are Yves of Compass Lexecon and Paolo Coghe of Acousmatics. A warm welcome to you both.
Thanks.
Thank you. Good morning.
What I'd like to start with, if I can turn to you first, Yves, maybe talking about France's renewables plans. I mean, it's clear it's a bit of a laggard in the European context. Maybe it didn't meet its 2020 targets, but it's about to publish its plans for 2030. So what's happening? What's going on in France in terms of the targets for the short term?
That's a really good question. I think France is trying to play kind of the long time or the long term decarbonization target in addition to just the 2030 target. And so as we've seen in the NECP published, the draft NECP published by the end of 2023, they kind of try to develop a new decarbonized target type of objective, which is, outside of the RED 3 detailed objective that would need to be complied with by the end of 2024.
By RED 3, you mean the Renewables Energy Directive coming from the EU? Yeah. Just exactly. For those listeners who may not be aware of that abbreviation. Yep.
So basically, France is trying to play on, I would say, two different levels. One is they would have to comply with the 2030 targets, and similarly to other countries, find a way of increasing and accelerating renewable development for 2030. And at the same time, they are already preparing the debate around the 2040 objective and trying to effectively develop some new type of targets and including nuclear as a way of decarbonizing the electricity market. And we can already see that there are effectively changes at the European level with regard to nuclear. If we look in details, I don't know if you've seen the 2040 impact assessment, but there is a call-out box in the 2040 impact assessment on the role of nuclear and saying that if the Commission had taken into account the latest announcement, then the scenarios would have been different and the impact assessment would have been different. And so obviously that's opening alternative for 2040.
In terms of nuclear, that is, yeah.
Exactly.
And the key here was maybe including nuclear as a green production fuel. Paolo.
Yes, indeed, and that any type of regulatory intervention that helps is much wanted and also needed, right? So that's what I was hinting at earlier in my presentation, is the fact that there isn't just an economic solution here. The need will also be for a political solution at all levels.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just for those listeners to be aware, we're speaking in the break of our French Energy Day, and I've taken you guys aside to go and delve into more detail. But if we return to the renewables targets here in France, Yves, what are your expectations about the plans that are going to be published in next month, I presume?
Well, European Commission deadline is June 2024. But we know that historically, and the latest example was 2023, France has always been late on publishing and releasing their NECP, so I would not bet before the end of 2024, I guess.
So the NECP, sorry to interject again, but that's the National Energy and Climate Plan,
yes.
Isn't it? Yeah, that every European member state is obliged to publish and send to the
Commission,
for
and
approval.
then needs to be effectively translated into national objectives and national laws, which would then be called the PP.
Yeah.
And so what we can see from the draft NECP of 2023 that provided some quantified numbers for the different technologies is effectively kind of echoing the general atmosphere around onshore wind development. So it's basically maintaining a rate of development, so around 1.2, 1.5 gigawatt on an annual basis, and not going really beyond. So it's kind of going a bit backwards compared to the previous PP, so which is obviously not what's pushed forward at the European level. But we see a significant acceleration effectively on solar PV and offshore wind. So obviously, as it was mentioned during the different presentations, solar PV seems to be effectively much faster to develop, and the technology to effectively bridge the gap between the time of development of offshore wind and the current need, the need for renewable energy in the next few years.
But so a slowing and effectively a slowing down of onshore wind capacity growth, but an acceleration of solar and offshore wind.
I would say not an acceleration on onshore wind.
Okay, yeah, okay. Just to make that clear, for
Yeah.
sure. That's and because we see in France's neighbours, the Netherlands in particular, Germany, which we'll turn to later, what the consequences of this is. But there's a huge growth in this type of
acceleration.
Yeah,
Exactly. And interestingly, what we see for IPPs in France, that were historically or initially mainly specialized in onshore wind development, for instance, what we can see now in their pipeline development is that they are all considering if really going onto the solar sector development and onto batteries as well. So they're really trying to expand across different sectors because obviously onshore wind market is going to stay but not really grow as expected before.
And how is this being financed? Or what's the plan in terms of how to finance that type of expansion?
For IPPs or for
No, so not the
capacities?
independent power producers, but more in terms of boosting that growth in terms of providing the incentives.
I think it's going in. That's the expectation that we can see from solar market participants is really increasing the capacity standard, and so the expectation is effectively from the current level of capacity being auctioned in the different tenders is going to up to 4 to 6 gigawatt on an annual basis, which would be necessary to meet the increased ambition for solar capacity. And so same for offshore wind. Everyone expect the macro auction to be held at some point in 2025 or 2026. I would say before the next presidential election. Now, whether it's 2025, 2026, it's yet to be seen.
Absolutely. And that the offshore wind is mainly on the Atlantic coast, or is it also some in the Mediterranean?
I would say that some capacities would be developed as well in the south, obviously, and especially for floating, because that's normally seas are calmer in the Mediterranean than the Atlantic, even though storms could be quite strong as well. But
and in terms of setting the scene, I'd also like to turn to you, Paolo, and to talk about a nuclear power and the French nuclear fleet. It's had some problems in recent years, but this year it seems to be ample supply, and it seems to be, the availability is certainly far higher than it has been in previous years. What's going on here?
Yes, you are right, Richard. There is plenty of availability now, partially because the levels in 2022 were so low that then 2023 and now 2024 could only be better, right? But it's part of this process that we've seen starting around 2014, where a lot of stations are taken down for ordinary and extraordinary maintenance. There are the inspections and so on and so forth. So a lot of the power stations are down, but they're not down forever, right? And you don't always find problems, even though EDF in the recent years has had their fair share of sort of maintenance-related problems. Let's think about the corrosion issues, but also welding issues, but also forgery issues. So they've had an interesting ride. The fact remains that even though we have plenty of availability now, there has been a structural decrease over the last 10, 15 years. And so even if we do much better than in the recent past, we're still dealing with a system that is essentially not functioning at 100%. And it hasn't been doing so for the last 10, 15 years. Then the rest is, do we have enough power? Yes. Do we have plenty of power? Yes. Do we have so much power that then prices are suffering? that seems to be the case, in particular at times where other technologies, namely solar PV, are peaking, right? They're both in terms of how much technology is installed and also how much of the electricity comes in, crucially in peak hours.
But the days of EDF or France's nuclear fleet generating between 350 to 400 terawatt hours per year, those days are gone, do you think?
Well, in the present, we can say they're gone. Are they gone forever? Well, you look at one of the 10-year planning exercises that RTE did, and they said that essentially they expect fairly soon for this quantity to be around 360, but that they see as a high scenario 400. Okay. So again, a high scenario at 400 is a far cry from what was the norm, around say 2005 or of above 400.
Absolutely. What's your view here, Yves, in terms of nuclear availability and how it's impacting renewables? I mean,
our views are effectively just in line with what Paolo was saying. So there is a new lower targeted level of nuclear generation for the foreseeable future at around 360 terawatt hours. So a reduction compared to the historical level. And interestingly, what we can see in our models is that with the planned increase of renewable capacity in France and neighboring countries, nuclear would have to flex down from time to time. So obviously, flexibility is not free for nuclear, and so would come at a cost, whether it's a cost of additional unavailability or whether it's a cost of managing the energy as a storage, for instance. But we see that given the situation that we currently have, for instance, with excess of solar at peak hours during the day, that would basically further increase in the coming years, and nuclear would have to reduce generation. And some capacities would have to reduce their generation level because the volume that can be stored in the short term is limited. So we see a nuclear generation which would be slightly lower than that, with periods in which effectively nuclear generation could reduce quite significantly and come back for the evening peak, for instance, or come back up for the morning peak as well.
Because flexibility, normally when I associate flexibility, I'm thinking, batteries or storage in a sense, or aggregators, both on the demand and on the production side. But with nuclear, what does that mean, flexibility, and how flexible are these big centralized reactors?
Paolo go into more details, but what's fascinating with nuclear generation in France is that, nuclear provide both the seasonal storage in France, and so you see that with the placement of the maintenance, mainly in summer or in spring and a bit of in autumn as well. So you've got a significant swing of available capacity and generation between summer and winter. And then when you look at the hourly generation level, you see that nuclear can effectively flex quite substantially. And without going into too much details, but I think what's considered as flexible potential is nearly 80% of the installed capacity for one unit. So which is for more than 1 gigawatt unit, more than 800 megawatt. So not achieved by any other technologies. But
Paolo, would you like to add to that?
I agree fully. The key here is that, as in principle, though, a nuclear station was not built or conceived to provide flexibility, but it can do it. It has done it. It has done it with some profit as well. And when it does it on a scale that's not matched by other types of generation. But nuclear was not conceived to provide flexibility, right? So there's also another important element that Yves mentioned, which is not only at the level of the single reactor, but you also have a decision as the operator, owner and operator, when to refuel, more or less, you've got fewer constraints when to refuel, when to conduct maintenance, when to turn the station down, when to turn it back on, and so on and so forth. Doing this over many units installed allows you also to, buy a little bit of that possibility, buy the option for yourself to have the possibility to flex.
I mean, I'm also interested, gentlemen, in addressing the issue of potential oversupply. I know it seems like a million miles where we were maybe 2016 to 2018 when the first issues with the steam generators, etc., came out and nuclear generation fell. But now with ample supply, with the inflow of solar, of and which the consequences there are often negative prices. I think France had the third highest instances of negative prices in Europe so far in 2024. Is the prospect here of oversupply in terms of too much power coming into the system, and how does that affect nuclear generation, Yves?
Yeah, well, if we can just come back on the oversupply situation, if you remember back in 2014-15, it was not the issue was not negative prices, but the issue was mothballing CCGTs because you had an excess of capacities, and so effectively some sort of additional market mechanism were to be put in place, capacity market, strategic reserve, XYZ, to ensure that these capacities would remain in the market even if not used. Now we are in the system in which you have much more non-controllable capacities that would basically feed into your electricity system, and effectively at time of excess of generation, you need to decide on which one to curtail. For now, the regulation is not so much designed to curtail renewable, and that's mainly because they don't have any incentives to reduce generation when there is an excess. But that can be easily controlled or easily changed with just a change of regulation. So we've seen that in new CFDs, there would be conditions on negative prices. Obviously, it takes time to put in place, and it's only for new projects. But we can see that they could change the regulation for the feed-in tariff, for instance, or for the existing fleet as well, to have an incentive to disconnect. Do not get their subvention, for instance, if the price gets negative, so that the technologies which are dispatched on a short-run marginal cost basis, or know that if they would turn down for just a couple of hours, for instance, would incur additional cost, could build in their correct opportunity cost not to close.
I mean, I think that's an important point, isn't it? Because what we're seeing now won't necessarily be the case in 2-3 years' time when the regulating and you get these clauses in the contracts for different contracts, for example, that will limit the amount of curtailment for or will add to the curtailment, natural curtailment of renewable plants. Anything to add here, Paolo? Are we?
No, but just to add, to use the cliche sentence which I must at all times
of course,
use at least one, is the devil is in the details.
Yeah.
And so to go back again to what Yves was saying, yes, there are and there will be periods of oversupply and undersupply, but that's what we essentially need in markets. And when supply is too low with respect to demand, prices tend to rise, which incentivizes new generation and so on and so forth. It's the usual behavior, except that nobody really knows how compressed the up and down cycles are, and nobody knows how regulation interacts and impacts these cycles.
And often the regulation would be reactive. It's sort of part after the case, So that's
yeah. And you don't, again, you don't see it at work immediately. So it not only it moves slower, but then it takes a little while to essentially come into place. And once regulation is there, also companies are very good at finding ways to be mindful of the regulation, but maybe pushing the envelope a little bit somewhere else.
Absolutely, finding little loopholes or whatever.
Finding loopholes, yeah.
Interestingly, the negative price issue was already on the table back in 2020, before the COVID, and obviously already quite on the table with the COVID impact on electricity system. But 4 years after, nothing has really changed in terms of price dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, it takes time.
Absolutely. And I think the negative price issue is very, very interesting because, if the general public knew that they would be paid to use their electricity, then I think demand would go up quite substantially, as it did on an occasion in Finland when there was a fat finger mistake there. But so we're seeing this onset, this massive growth in solar. Wind is coming as well. What does that mean in terms of the economics of certainly new nuclear, but also new renewables? I mean, if investors are saying, wholesale prices could remain low. What does that mean here, Yves?
Well, in our modeling, we see that development of merchant renewable capacities would remain or would be quite limited to specific countries or specific bidding zones, because given the scale that is at stake and considered to be developed in, say, continental Europe, for instance, when you put 600 gigawatt of solar capacity, while the summer peak of demand is not even 400 gigawatt, you basically build an oversupply of 200 gigawatt just because of the objective. And so meaning that the marginal value of solar generation for the electricity system would be really low or negligible in any case, and so would highly prevent merchant development of renewable or solar capacities. And so what we see is mainly being developed through tenders, CFDs, or long-term PPAs as well for industrials which are interested to have like specific ad hoc contracts. But we don't see market development being really the main route to market for renewable capacities. And so the same for nuclear. Well, obviously nuclear has different issues at stake, but similarly seeing merchant development of nuclear capacity would be quite challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. What's your view here, Paolo? I mean, I think, we have seen France has clear ambitions to build new generation nuclear power stations. But at the same time, it wants to roll out renewables and as often is being forced to do so from Brussels. Can it do both?
That is the $1 million question. Actually, 1 million is probably too little. The answer is, of course, I don't know, but I am a bit concerned that they will have enough resources, both in terms of capital resources, but also in terms of sort of brain pool resources, to be able to pull off this task, which is quite hard, right? The one of building essentially a brand new generation of nuclear units, and also dedicate time and resources and money to developing renewables. At the same time, they don't have a choice, right? If play by the rules, they don't have a choice. So they will find a way to at least go some of the way towards the goal.
And we're talking eye-watering amounts of money here.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, indeed. And the finances are maybe a bit rocky as well.
As you know, when we also say about financing the new nuclear deal, it's clear that the amounts of money are extremely large, but also so is the complexity of the whole undertaking. This is, we like to think that EDF is going to put, some nuclear stations, which is true, on the ground. But at the same time, they need to rely on tens, dozens, if not hundreds of other companies, all part of the nuclear filière nucléaire, so of the sector, that themselves need to finance their hiring. If they've got to increase hiring to meet the goals of EDF in the construction of a site, they will need to hire. To hire, they need to have the cash to hire, and so on and so forth. So there's a knock-on effect, which public money helps with this. Okay, so again, we're going to have to look at this famous role of the of the regulator or of institutions in helping reach some of these targets.
Absolutely. What's your view? Can France do both?
Well, interestingly, if you look at the full system energy cost in different scenarios, and that's the exercise that RD has done back in when they published their long-term 2050 scenarios, and that's exercise that we can do as well. You see that a scenario with nuclear capacity would show a slightly lower cost than the scenario 100% renewable. So in any case, that's kind of, I would say, a cost saving for the society to have a combination of nuclear and renewable energies. And in all decarbonization scenarios, you would have a significant investment required to decarbonize not only electricity, but the full energy sectors. And so if really the challenge for decarbonization is that you will have to switch from, I would say, annual OPEX-based type of model. So which is mainly, you've got large annual expenditures of fuel costs mainly at the moment. And so it's quite easy to finance because you don't have to finance that 10 years in advance. So switching to, in any scenario of complying with decarbonization, to a capex-intensive type of energy mix. And so effectively the question of how you finance and make sure that you reduce as much as possible the financing cost of the transition would basically a question to address in any of the scenarios. And interestingly, with assumptions that we can take now on the cost evolution of the different technologies, a scenario with some nuclear generation would lead to lower system cost. So would lead to lower financing issues.
No, fascinating. I mean, if I can get the crystal ball out a bit now, Paolo, I mean, I know you've mentioned, I think you both stated that any new build is going to take at least 15 years based on past practice. It was a number that has been bandied about anyway. But in that time, when you have this period of massive renewables rollout, negative prices, surely, and I think you made this point, Paolo, that there could be alternatives. We don't know that they are there, but there's sort of black swan moment where, for example, for storage, for batteries, some kind of flexibility, some people using the opportunity provided by these negative prices or that very low price scenario to develop something else. I mean, what's your view here? I know it's a tricky question to ask you to look into the future there, Paolo.
Yeah, well,
it's something you're very good at.
But I know, but Yves is the one with the crystal ball. So, but still, nevertheless, it is possible. Like in all things, I think that people in business do things for business reasons, right? And so there will be developer trying to make their case to put even more solar, even more wind, just like people in the nuclear industry believe in the renaissance, right? And the key here is to find the balance. And there's plenty of good economic consultancies with their own crystal balls that are helping in this because they... the value of a scenario is not just giving you the results of the scenario, but is in providing you with a framework to think about these issues and to see what what a potential path is, right? What a potential evolution is. I personally, without the crystal ball here, cannot see an evolution where any of these technologies is preponderant with respect to the others. So, keeping in mind that nuclear is in the DNA of the energy industry in France, I don't think we will go to push all for nuclear. I think there will be some balancing that will occur, but then don't ask me how or when, because it might take a strong effort, as I mentioned before, by institutions, national and supranational, to balance it all.
But I mean, I don't know what your view is here, Yves, but there's a lot of smart money out there looking at the possibilities and opportunities that that the companies such as yourselves are highlighting for these people, for these types of investors.
So yeah, if you look at the current trend in the market, so there is a lot of hype around battery development at the moment, but the market is not yet there for battery to be large scale batteries to be economic just based on arbitrage, because obviously we talk a lot about the fact that you will have a lot of low prices and effectively opportunities to charge your battery, but then you need to have opportunities to discharge and correctly value the money at which you would discharge them. So obviously if the gas price decreases as well, then that value decreases at the same time. So what's really of interest and what's really key for flexibility and storage providers is really the difference between the low and the max. So in the crisis situation where prices were hitting like €1,000 or something, opportunities were effectively there. Now in a world in which gas prices and CO2 prices do not increase as much as one would have expected, then the spread and the difference between min and max reduces as well. And so the case for large-scale storage is not yet fully economic and still requires a lot of additional remuneration through ancillary services or through capacity markets. And requires as well quite a bit of cost reduction that we can start seeing. But the equation is not yet fully squared at the moment.
I think that could be the subject for another podcast, gentlemen. But Yves and Paolo, thank you very much for being guests on the Montel Weekly Podcast this week.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Richard.